Julien walked out of the hospital, the sharp fall air stinging at his cheeks as he walked down the dusty path to the barracks. The day had been long and stressful, filled with never-ending operations and frantic attempts to save troops' lives. As he went, he noticed a young woman approaching him from behind, her face flushed with pleasure and her eyes blazing with enthusiasm. "Hi," she murmured, her voice echoing in the nighttime silence. "You're Julien, correct? What about the doctor?" When he gazed into her big smile and sparkling eyes, he nodded, his heart quickening. "That's correct," he answered, trying not to shake his voice. "My name is Helen." She introduced herself, reaching out her hand. "I work as a volunteer at the hospital. I've noticed you a couple times." Julien grasped her hand, a spark of excitement coursing through his body at the contact of her flesh. "Nice to meet you," he replied, barely audible above a whisper. Julien and Helen spent as much time as they could together over the next 3 weeks. They discussed everything and anything, expressing their aspirations and anxieties for the future. They took refuge in each other's presence as the battle raged around them, clinging to the moments of serenity and love that they could find. Helen approached Julien one day with a desperate expression on her face. "My brother has been hurt," she continued, her voice trembling. "He's on the front lines, and they need his assistance. Won't you please accompany me, Julien?" Julien made no hesitation. He gathered his medical supplies and followed Helen out of the hospital, through the dirt roads, and toward the sound of gunshots. They arrived to see mayhem and ruin, with troops shouting and suffering as explosives burst all around them. Despite the risk, Julien and Helen worked diligently to save the wounded soldiers' lives, performing emergency procedures amid the turmoil. Yet, in the middle of it all, Julien was wounded by shrapnel, and the power of the explosion threw him backwards. He woke up in a hospital bed, his body hurting and his brain pounding with anguish. But as he opened his eyes, he found Helen seated next to him, her hand securely clasping his. "I feared I'd lost you," she continued, her voice cracking as she cried. Julien glanced up at her, his heart full of love. "I'm here," he said, his voice firm and determined. Julien and Helen were inseparable from that point on. They chatted about their future, about how they might make a life together despite the conflict. Then one day, they decided to get married in the hospital, in front of their patients and friends. Julien and Helen left France after the war ended and came to America, where Julien could continue his medical profession. They dedicated the remainder of their lives to their jobs and to each other. Yet, despite many difficulties along the way, their love never faltered. Their hearts were permanently connected. Julien reflected on their lives together and realized he had never been happier. He had found love in the darkest of times, and that love had supported him through every adversity and challenge. He closed his eyes and smiled as he lay in bed, surrounded by the memories of a life well lived, knowing that his love for Helen would go on long after he was gone.